I've done a number of these education outreach talks to judges, and each time I found it remarkably rewarding. The questions, the level of engagement has just been fantastic, and I look forward to the discussion this morning. So in thinking about what to talk about today, the panel is on both use of brain-based methods for the detection of memories, brain-based methods for the detection of lies, perhaps. In my portion of the talk, of this symposium, I'll talk specifically about work on memory detection. Towards the very end, I'll allude to some of the things that we've been doing on the lie detection side. Nita will then talk more about lie detection, and then we hope to have a group discussion. Please feel free to stop me at any point along the way for clarification and any other questions you may have. So I've learned over my 6 years or so that the MacArthur Network on Law and Neuroscience has been going, that the two cultures come together. One thing I've learned as part of the legal culture is I should start with a case study. And so I will do so, and this is the case study that actually got me intrigued. Why show up and participate in sort of this interdisciplinary sort of meeting between neuroscience and the law? In Mumbai, India, they have a forensics lab, and the forensics lab is an EEG lab, and they bring in suspects. And in 2008, this suspect, Aditi Sharma, was brought in. She was accused of murdering her husband with arsenic, and they brought her into the state-run forensics lab, connected up EEG, put on scalp electrodes, and presented her crime-relevant facts about the murder. And based on analysis of the EEG data, the state forensic scientist determined that she had guilty knowledge, crime-relevant knowledge, and that she could only have acquired this knowledge by actually being present at the time of the crime, and actually having participated in the acts. This case, it's one of apparently over 100 cases where this technology has been used and entered into the courtrooms, into the courts in India. And this case came to the international community's attention when Sharma was actually convicted of murder, what appeared largely based on or heavily influenced by the neuroscience data. All the other evidence was circumstantial, and if you read the magistrate's sort of opinion, it's clear that he weighed the neuroscience data quite seriously. With that case coming to the international community's attention, as well as the emergence of these corporations, No Lie MRI, Cephos, which we heard a little bit about, selling their fMRI-based lie detection methods, selling their methods, and the attempt to try to get these data into the courts, there was a call in one of the leading neuroscience journals to neuroscientists, basically saying, step up, do critical analysis of these methods. There needs to be hopefully an impartial sort of look at the tools and begin to weigh in here. And it's not the kind of thing that scientists often do, and it's also both weighing in on these on the use of these tools, but also it's not the kind of thing that it's easy to do because it's difficult to get the support you need to do this critical analysis. So it was around that time, fortuitously, that the first phase of the MacArthur Network was just getting going, and it has been a pleasure and an honor to sort of work on these problems with the support of the network. So what I'm going to talk about is principally motivated by the Sharma case, trying to ask the question not with EEG. The methods used in the Mumbai lab, as far as I know, still have not been extensively subject to peer review. If at all subject to peer review, we don't know much about the methods. I'm going to talk about fMRI, sort of given what I believe is the increased sensitivity of fMRI, if there's going to be some promise here in terms of being able to use brain-based methods to say something about whether or not a person has knowledge. It may well be through the use of fMRI plus advanced imaging data analysis techniques that one can apply. I'll talk about some work that we've done that suggests maybe there's a little bit of promise here, more than I think I would have predicted heading into this exercise. Then I'll talk about the peril, talk about the unknown, and then conclude with some comments about fMRI-based detection, lie detection. All right, so just kind of approach this question with sort of a cold, I don't have an agenda here. I always like to and want to make this point clear. I don't have an agenda to demonstrate that fMRI can be used to detect memories. I don't have an agenda to demonstrate or that fMRI cannot be used to detect. I want to sort of see what the data tell us. So we started rather simple. We wanted sort of controlled studies in the lab. We started with a controlled study in the lab where the first question is just if I have subjects encounter stimuli in a very controlled setting, and then after they've encountered those stimuli, I place them in a scanner, I have them make memory judgments about stimuli that they've encountered before, that I had shown them, and novel stimuli. Can I look at their brain patterns and know which of these stimuli they'd actually seen before, and which of them are they actually recognizing? They're having this subjective or psychological experience of perceiving the stimulus as old or previously encountered. So in the lab, is it me or is that dim? In the lab, they came in, and we gave them a list of 200 faces, one face at a time. And this was the study experience. They encountered individual faces. Each face was presented for a mere 3 seconds. They were not in the scanner. Following the study phase, we put them in the MR scanner. We presented them 400 faces, the 200 faces that they'd encountered during the study period, and then 200 novel faces. And their task in this first experiment was, when each face was presented, to tell us whether or not that face elicited this sense of familiarity. They remembered having seen the face before in the study period, or they perceived it as novel. They don't actually didn't recognize the stimulus as old. And so for the test phase, we have, of course, objectively 2 kinds of stimuli: faces that the person had previously seen and novel faces. But of course, these 2 kinds of stimuli give rise to different memory outcomes, right? So for old faces, faces that they'd studied, they might actually recognize the face. I recognize that as a previously encountered stimulus that we'd call a hit. Or they might actually have failed to remember the face, and they might respond novel, new, mistakenly, and this would be a miss. For new faces, they might actually have a false memory. Even though they hadn't previously encountered this face, they might have this sense of recognition and they might respond old, that would be a false alarm, or they might correctly perceive that face as novel and they'd call it new, and that'd be a correct rejection. Okay. So what are we asking? We want to know, can I know by whether or not the person recognizes the stimulus, the face, or perceives it as novel, just by looking at their pattern of brain activity elicited by each stimulus? As we know from discussions yesterday, and you know much better than I, the law cares about the individual, right? So we want to be able to answer this question, not at the group level, but at the individual subject level, and not only at the individual subject level, but at the individual item level. Can I provide a probabilistic statement about, for a given item, looking at their brain patterns, how well do I do in terms of knowing whether or not the person is recognizing the stimulus or perceiving it as novel? Yesterday, Jeff did a great presentation on fMRI methods. I was struck by many things from his presentation. It was quite elegant. The thing that perhaps distressing for me that I was most struck by is we came up together in the 90s. We got our training in the 90s. He ages so much better than I do. I lost sleep last night over that. I could not quite figure it out. But anyway, let's get back to the more important things, or less distressing things. All right, so he talked about how one might treat data. And he talked about how for every sort of volume of data we collect, you have these multiple points, these voxels in the brain. And the traditional way of treating data is to look at the signal in each point, in each voxel, and ask, how does it change between my conditions, right? And you might average data over an hour's worth of data and get the mean signal intensity at that voxel for condition 1, say recognition, versus the mean signal intensity at that voxel for condition 2, say perceiving the stimulus as novel. Over the last decade or so, the field of neuroscience has begun to combine fMRI data with advances on the machine learning front, statistical techniques to essentially treat data beyond the single voxel level, but actually to try to analyze your data by looking at the whole pattern of activation across all of the voxels in the brain and try to understand whether or not we can differentiate between patterns of activation that reflect condition 1 or state 1 versus condition 2, state 2. And so that's what we're doing in this work. Instead of analyzing the data at individual points, we're taking the volume of data and we're looking at the pattern of activation across those data. To do this, you might take a subset of your data, a subset of the brain volumes that you acquired for some of the faces during the test period, during scanning. And you know for those training data points that, well, some of the faces were old and they were recognized. Other faces were new and they were perceived as novel. And what you do is you take this, the whole pattern of data associated with each of these outcomes, and you feed it into a machine learning algorithm that can, in essence, come to learn, try to sort of find a hyperplane that essentially differentiates as best as it can the pattern of activation across voxels associated with, say, perceiving a stimulus as novel versus perceiving a stimulus as old. Okay? Once you have this, you can then ask, how well can I do in making a prediction about what the person's psychological state is given this a pattern of brain data? So you train the classifier on a subset of your data to try to learn about these two different neural states that are associated with, say, memory versus perceiving a stimulus as novel. And then you take a test pattern that the classifier doesn't know anything about, feed its pattern into the classifier, and the classifier is going to make a prediction. And it may, in this case, say, well, that stimulus, that brain pattern is associated with the person perceiving the stimulus as novel. And you can ask, how well do you do? What's important about this is you can do this at the individual subject level, and you can do this at the individual trial level, right? You have a single brain pattern, and you've got an outcome. And across trials, of course, you can see how well you're doing. But you get a unique prediction for each trial. All right. So, any questions about the methods? Because now the data are just going to kind of fly at you.
Who was your subject cohort? Were they young people, old people?
That's a great question. So, in fact, as we start talking about not only this work, but fMRI-based lie detection, almost all the subject cohorts are young adults, young, healthy adults. That's the case here, 18 to 35-year-olds, mixtures of males and females. They're drawn from the community that we typically draw from in terms of the Stanford community. So in relation to my question yesterday, the economic and educational background of these subjects is probably not at the mean for the country. All right.
Yesterday we saw those incredible pictures about how atypical the brain pattern of a psychopath is. So unless that is found, we have some cohort of psychopaths and can measure their brain reaction. How valid is your data, number one?
That's right. So both of these are actually in the unknowns part, the risks part. So we started off, frankly, given the case and the question, I didn't know how well the method would do. So we just wanted to know in a highly controlled, restricted sample, how well can one do? What do the data tell us in that regard? Where are there points of concern, even within that restricted sort of population? And then where do you need to go next to think about real-world application and differences, group differences, psychopaths versus not, many other sort of subpopulations from our overall population of humans are fundamental questions.
Yeah. The second part of that, you just used the word prediction about the possibility of what's happening with memory, but I assume that the prediction is expressed in terms of some relation to a standard deviation, and you're doing it in terms of the percentage of likelihood.
Exactly. But let me get to the data. But that is exactly right. Okay. All right. So I'm not sure why, but the connection seems to keep going out in and out. I hope this is okay. So we're starting off first level question. we've got old faces, we've got new faces that the subject is encountering in the scanner, and they're indicating whether or not they recognize the face in front of them or perceiving it as novel. So the first question is, can we look at their brain patterns and know whether or not they're perceiving an old face as old, or perceiving a new face as new, okay? So this is comparing hits to correct rejections, and we started off training the classifier on data from not the whole brain, but most of the brain, pattern of activation across most of the brain, 23,000 voxels. And here's how we do on average across our 18 subjects or so in this study. I forgot how many in this particular study. About 83%. Okay? And each of these data points is a single subject. If you shuffle the data, we know for certain that chance is 50%. So we're well above chance. 83% is surprising for me initially, but in hindsight, not that surprising. But we're doing fairly well. So we can look at somebody's brain pattern and know whether or not they're perceiving an old item as old, perceiving a new item as new.
May I just clarify? So this is 83% accuracy in using your predictive tool to predict correctly whether or not it's an old hit or new. So this is looking forward and making actual predictions based on what you learned here for new events that you're then using this to predict. Is that
Yes. Yes, and I'm going to go even further. I'm going to show you in a few minutes, I can train the classifier on data from Jeff's brain and do just about as well when making predictions about what's going on in my brain and mind.
One more question. What was the period of time between the time they saw the images and the time that they...
Great question. So issues of retention interval, those in the real world are fundamental. Here, starting off very controlled. They studied the list of words outside of the scanner. Took about 15, 20 minutes to get them set up in the scanner and get going. The beginning of the test period started thereafter, so the mean retention interval was probably on the order of about an hour once you go across all the scans. So great question, we're going to come to that. All right, so we're doing fairly well. If you now, instead of using 23,000 in voxels, you use smaller clusters of voxels in particular areas of the brain. Even by looking at a group of 123 voxels in a single point in the brain, you could be well over 65, 70%. You're doing reasonably, we're doing above chance. I don't know what reasonably well is in terms of the applied setting. Okay. Another thing to note here is, so the first thing we've demonstrated now is we can differentiate hits from correct rejections, but that's differentiating old stimuli from new stimuli, so the true status of the stimulus. It's also differentiating the subjective experience of recognizing a stimulus versus the subjective experience of perceiving it as novel. So we now wanted to say, well, can I control for one of those factors and see how well we do on the other? So first we wanted to ask, well, can we differentiate when somebody perceives a stimulus as old versus perceives it as new? Okay, so we want to hold the objective status of the stimulus constant. So these are all old items. Some of them they recognize as old, they're perceiving it as old. Some of them they're forgetting, they're perceiving it as novel. And again, we're significantly above chance in all subjects. What about the reverse, truly new faces? Can we read out from their brain patterns this subjective experience of recognizing the stimulus even when they're mistaken in having that memory state? And again, we're well above chance, but greater variance there. Okay. These classifiers are making essentially likelihood. They're giving you a likelihood estimate for any given item, so you can use that likelihood estimate as kind of a measure of how much evidence is in the brain pattern, favoring one particular psychological state versus another. And so what I've shown you thus far is collapsed across all of the trials, but there are going to be trials, stimuli, that elicit a brain pattern that's more sort of indicative of this perception of recognition or this psychological state of recognition versus other trials where it's on the same side of the decision bound for the classifier, but the evidence is weaker. Okay? And so some trials are going to be not far from the decision bound. The classifier, by looking at the brain patterns, may be correct, but its estimate will be less certain, if you will. And other trials, the evidence will be much stronger. And so if you wanted to think about real-world application, you might say, okay, well, 83%, that's fine, that's well above chance, but I don't feel comfortable with that. I'd like to actually have even a higher accuracy and greater certainty that I should be trusting the classifier. And so you can actually use classifier evidence to reassess. You can basically ask, how well do these techniques do when I'm systematically listening to the classifier when the classifier has more and more evidence. Stated another way, I might want to know how accurate is the classifier when the classifier is reporting out it's got a lot of evidence. Okay? And as you go to the right, where we're systematically moving further and further up in terms of evidence, neural evidence, if you will, you can see that we're driving detection rates towards ceiling in terms of hits versus correct rejections, but also we're driving detection rates up. So if you want to use this classifier, if I'm trying to sell my wares here, if you want to use it, you can use it in a more conservative manner. You can say, well, over here, that's kind of an ambiguous outcome. I don't feel comfortable with that. But when the classifier has a lot of evidence, it tends to be fairly accurate. So we might want to listen in there. All right, let's now start. It's going to go quickly because I realize I'm probably already near the end of my time, and I'm halfway through the talk. Owen's looking at me going, this seems vaguely familiar to me. All right, so this will go fairly quickly though. Okay, let's move out of the lab. Let's go to real world memories. We're now we've had subjects wear digital cameras by Vicon, a spin-off of Microsoft, where what the cameras do, you wear them around your neck. They've got various sensors on them, and they automatically take a snapshot of what's going on if you move, if there's a change in lighting or whatever. And so over a 3-week period, we had subjects wear these cameras. We collected 45,000 photographs that are essentially a photo record of their lives. And we can now use the photographs to probe what the neural patterns are for real-world autobiographical memories and see how well we do in terms of detecting now real-world, more complex events versus single faces. Okay, so you bring them in the scanner. Sorry, I'm going to flip through this. We present them a 4-photo sequence from some event upwards of a month ago. Or as close to 1 week ago, because we recorded over a 3-week period in this study. We have them make various memory judgments. The bottom line is, here are individual subjects, but without even having to restrict the classifier, assessing the classifier's performance on trials where the classifier has the greatest evidence. This is across all trials. On average, the classifier is 91% accurate in looking at a brain pattern and knowing whether or not the person is perceiving that sequence of photos as having come from their life upwards of a month ago, or from not coming from their lives, from somebody else's camera. I'll skip over the brain points. We also can differentiate. We know you walk into this room, you're probably all neurobiologically healthier than I. I often walk into conferences like this, and I have 2 different kinds of memory phenomena. I see somebody's face, and I go, and I consciously can recollect, oh, that's so-and-so, and we previously encountered each other in this context, and we talked about X. A lot of the times, it's, I've got this sense that I know that person. They're vaguely familiar. And in fact, it's even more indicative because they're talking to me and they're using my name and they're telling me that we went out and had dinner last time or whatever. But so you can have these 2 different kinds of states elicited by stimuli, right? This sense of familiarity but not being able to bring details to mind, or you can bring details to mind, this rich recollection about the past event. And in fact, the classifier can significantly, above chance, differentiate between these 2 different kinds of states of recognition or states of remembering. All right. This will go, so I had alluded to a moment ago, if you want to think about this in the real world, how you might apply this, wouldn't it be great that you didn't have to bring in the individual, acquire some training data from that particular individual, train up the classifier on that subject's brain patterns, and then test them on the critical questions or the critical stimuli that you care about? Turns out you can do, as I alluded to a moment ago, you can test the classifier trained on other people's brains on data from now an individual where the classifier has not seen any data from that individual. And statistically across the 2 experiments that we've run, you do just as well. So within subject testing, training the classifier in subject 1, tested on subject 1, or across subject training on other subjects, testing on a particular subject, you do just as well in being able to classify people's memory states. Sorry, this is for the real world stimuli. This is for the photographs of faces, stimuli in the lab, here within subject, here across subject. Statistically, you're doing just as well. And moreover, you can train the classifier off of data from the lab and other subjects looking at faces and making recognition decisions about faces, and now testing off of the brain patterns for the other group of subjects who are making recognition memory decisions about these complex real-world experiences, and you're well above chance. Okay. All right, so if I wanted to perhaps make some money, I might stop here and say, okay, great, doing pretty well. That's the promise. What about the peril? And there are a number of points here. This will go hopefully quicker than the front part, but it's a lot shorter, Owen, so we won't go long. Or Francis. Yeah, if Francis is the one who's nervous here, it's like, oh, okay. All right, quickly, there are caveats. One, if you look at the evidence for, in terms of where the evidence is that differentiates, say, hits from correct rejections, hits from misses, or false memories from correct rejections, you see that similar regions in the brain are carrying the evidence. There's high similarity between true recognition and false recognition. And we kind of know this from prior studies in the literature. Caveat one, while we can differentiate between this subjective state of recognizing something versus the subjective state of perceiving a stimulus as novel, we do much worse in knowing whether or not their recognition is based on true memory or false memory. Okay? So that's over here. Hits versus false. So true recognition versus false recognition, we're above chance, but we're not well above chance. Here, misses, old stimuli that the person perceives as new stimuli that the person perceives as new. There's no marker here of the true status of the item without the subjective state of recognition. So poor classification of subjective judgments. Poor classification of true experiential history, and in fact, when you do this trick of only listening to the classifier when it has the greatest evidence, we don't do much better. Okay. Second caveat, how a person approaches the task fundamentally matters. In the second experiment, what we had subjects do, same study phase for faces. In one test now, rather than having them make explicit memory judgments, they just saw the faces and they had to make male-female judgments. Half of the faces were old, half of the faces were new. So when we did not orient people to memory, we wanted to know, could we nevertheless discriminate between old stimuli and new stimuli? And the other half of the experiment, they then did the explicit task. Here's how we do. When they're making explicit memory judgments, we have half as much data, so we're not up at 83%, but we're still well above chance. When they're making memory decisions, they know they're orienting to the stimulus and memory matters, you're above chance. When memory is incidental to the task, they're not orienting towards memory, we're above chance, but not much above chance. Okay, so memory processes are not automatically triggered, they depend upon a person's goal, and this raises the possibility that countermeasures might actually beat the technique. Nita can testify to this. This is the last data point. We've now tested whether or not you can adopt countermeasures and alter how well the classifier does. Study phase, again, outside of the scanner shouldn't be there. Test first, explicit, they're making old new recognition decisions and they're trying to be cooperative. Second half of the experiment, we tell them what we're trying to do is actually read out from your brain patterns whether or not you're recognizing the stimulus as old or perceiving it as novel. We've been able to do this in the past. We want you to adopt a countermeasure strategy to try to beat the system. If you perceive it as novel, try to bring back other memories from your life. If you perceive the stimulus as familiar, as old, try to focus in on some idiosyncratic feature of the stimulus. You go from above chance, again around 70%, we have to chance performance when they're adopting this countermeasure strategy. All right, so here's the wrap-up. How well can we do with fMRI to detect memories? Yes, fMRI can discriminate between whether somebody is perceiving a stimulus as old or novel with reasonably high accuracy, both for simple lab-based memories and even does better for more complex real-world memories. However, not so well if you view this differently. Under lab-based conditions, we only modestly discriminate between true versus false memory, and we do rather poor. We fail in terms of detecting the true status of a stimulus when the person doesn't recognize the stimulus. Also not well in the sense that the subject's approach to the task has a substantial effect. That's the implicit explicit, and that's also the countermeasure point. Unknowns, and these go to the questions that came up. The powerful thing, I think, in the Bios case, the Mabai case, is the statement that not only is there evidence of memory in the person's brain patterns, but that I know the source of the memory, that it came about from having participated. There's no data, as far as I know, that weighs in on how accurately these methods can detect the source of knowledge, whether it's participation versus imagining versus learning about the events from others. And that's going to be a very challenging task, I predict. The age of the memory, issues of retention interval are fundamental. We're beginning to look at this. We have a 7-month, 4-month, and 1-month retention interval study that we're just about to go to scanning in a couple of weeks on, so we'll have some data on that. Correlated with retention intervals, practice effects, we're going to take a look at that. What about the affective processes, both about the nature of the event, as well as about their sense of stress and threat during the event, and their sense of threat and stress during their acts of retrieval. These are high-stakes retrieval contexts if you're in the scanner, right, whether it's lie detection or memory detection. We're starting to look at this latter, and we have a study that we're launching an EEG. We actually have data on an EEG study from 14 subjects, and we'll be launching an MRI study soon. Group differences, fundamental, and all the work that we've done, and I don't know of much other work, have all been in healthy young adults. All right, I'm going to stop here. There's much I could say following Nita's presentation on fMRI-based lie detection. I participated as an expert witness in a case, the Greg Smith case in Maryland, where he was accused of murder, having killed his Army Ranger buddy. And during the retrial of that case, they went to no-lie MRI and wanted to enter in fMRI-based lie detection data, and based on analyses of the literature, I weighed in, arguing it was premature. I'm happy to have that discussion during the Q&A. Nita? These are